HD SLR shooter. Brought to you by Adobe, Akidio, Animus, Black Magic Design, Carl Zeiss, Shutterstock, and That Studio.
What was going through your mind when this role was offered to you?
I got the script. I think there was a group of actors that working title were thinking of to get the film financed, so I think neither Felicity nor I were big enough names to get the film financed. But then I sort of bludgeoned. I'd done Les Miserables, which working title had made, and I read this script, and my brilliant agent here managed to sort of guilt trip the guys at working title into at least allowing me a phone call with James, the director. And James lived in Copenhagen, and so we spoke on the phone, and as I was saying before, I tried to speak really passionately and confidently. And he then came to London, and we went to a pub, and it was a Tuesday afternoon, and it was, I'll never forget it, because he basically said, "What do you want to drink?" And it was something, that killer question. It was like, what sort of actor does he want me to be? Like, am I meant to be like Oliver Reed, or am I meant to be like, do you want it? And so I was like, I said, beer? and he was like, okay, Eddie will have a beer, I'll have a coffee. And I was like, oh God. At which point he basically went on to have about 5 espressos. He just got like wired on caffeine. And I had about 5 pints and got really drunk. And somewhere along the line, we basically realized that we were both really pretty scared of the project. But we opened ourselves up to those fears and what the work would take and what it would do. And fortunately, he then cast me. What was hilarious was then so that was without an audition. And I don't know, you'd have to ask James why, it was sort of blind faith. I think they're probably too scared to test. But then this thing happened where they were auditioning for Jane, and Felicity was coming to audition. And I kept getting these calls from James going, by the way, this isn't an audition for you. Your cast, this isn't an audition for you. And then he would call up and go, by the way, Eddie, this isn't an audition. I was like, you doth protest too much. This is definitely an audition for me. I was like, don't for a second think this isn't going to, Donna Langley at the head of Universal, all of the sort of the focus groups. And fortunately, that audition, Felicity was an old friend again, and someone, we'd never worked together, we'd known each other, and fortunately something happened in that room that got people excited.
That scared me when you were saying that, though, but it's not an audition for you, it's not an audition. It is in your mind.
But also, I don't know how you guys find, but I find it's a mixed blessing not auditioning. Because if you don't audition, you're like, yes, I don't have to go through that horrific process. But then you turn up on day one, and you open your mouth the first time, sort of look behind the camera, and you see producers going, I know, that's exactly like that. And so sometimes, at least if you've auditioned, you've given them some sense of what you're going to do. I never know which is better, to audition or not to audition. I read this script, and it really hit me in an incredibly sort of visceral way. I thought it was going to be a biopic of Stephen's life, and what I read was this really intricate and incredibly passionate but complicated love story about two really quite brilliant people. And when I heard that James Marsh was directing, I'd seen Man on Wire, which is one of my favourite films of all time. And
great documentary that won an Oscar, actually. The director of this film did that movie.
And so the idea of that director with this subject matter was an incredibly tantalising combination. And so I did that thing that, I don't know, you go for auditions for things, and you do zillions of auditions, and you rarely get the parts. There are some wonderful statistics out there, which my dad always reminds me of. But you go and you pursue particularly those ones that are as interesting as this full-heartedly. I don't think you ever really expect to get them. But my God, do you tell the people in charge how confident you are about how you would go about it. You do all that thing that you do when you're sort of trying to get a job of lying. And so then when I actually got the job, it was this amazing, it did really feel special. I felt like it was an extraordinary opportunity to tell a really beautiful story, but at the same point I knew that Stephen and Jane and Jonathan and the children, would end up seeing the film, and that however well we did, if they didn't enjoy it, if they didn't believe in it, then it would have been a bit of an upset really, and so that those stakes or that weight was definitely on James, the director, and Felicity, my shoulders for a few months. Anyway, when they saw the film, they were so kind about it, and I've slept really well ever since.
But you also had something most actors don't have in most roles they play, you know, the guy you're playing sitting there on set at one point. Yeah, he was there. And what was that like for you?
Well, so I met Stephen just before we started filming, and that had been an extraordinary interaction for a few hours. And then our first week of filming, we shot in Cambridge. We shot all the exteriors in Cambridge, and it was on our second day that we were shooting the May Ball, the big fireworks display scene, and Felicity and I were there, and there were thousands of extras, and they had 3 sets of fireworks. So we had 3 takes to get the fireworks out. So everyone was a bit nervous about that because, you know, fireworks are very expensive. And so we needed to get those shots in those 3 takes. And then on cue, just as the first set of fireworks went off, Stephen arrived, flanked by his nurses, you know, his famous silhouette, and he was literally spotlit by his computer screen. And on cue, the fireworks went off, and I describe it as like the greatest rock star entrance you have ever seen in your life. But that evening, Jane and Jonathan also came to set, and Tim and Lucy, 2 of Stephen and Jane's children, and Felicity and I'll never forget, we were doing the scene when we're on the bridge. And out of one eye line we could see Stephen and his nurses, and out of the other we could see Jane and Jonathan, and we just sort of got closer together going, come on, head down. Stay focused. But it was pretty intimidating.
That's got to be the scariest thing ever.
Well, I would say the scariest thing was seeing him just before he went to see the film. I mean, that's actually the scariest moment.
Oh yeah, so you were there when he came in with his,
yeah,
you know.
He came to Working Title, the producers in London, and they had a screening for him. And I was rehearsing something, so I couldn't see him afterwards, but I saw him just before, and I said to him, look, Steve, I'm really nervous, but do let me know what you think. And he took a while. He now just uses this muscle under his eye, so he has glasses with a sensor, and then on the computer screen he has the alphabet with this cursor that goes across the alphabet, and it stops every time he twitches this muscle underneath his eye. So that's on one letter. So it can take 10 minutes, 8 minutes for him to spout a sentence. So there was this long, long pause, and I said, let me know what you think. And his response was, I will let you know what I think, good or otherwise. to which I sweat sort of pouring out. And I said, okay, Stephen, if it's otherwise, please just stick to the word otherwise. Let's not go into like all of the minutiae of all the details. And anyway, so no, fortunately, he was incredibly generous and has been, which was just a wonder. When you meet Stephen, the illness is entirely secondary to him. After he was diagnosed at age 21, he has paid very little interest to it. He's lived forward and passionately and fully. And
73 years old.
73 years old, completely defied expectation. And what I was keen to do when I read the script is it wasn't a story about an illness or about a physicality. It was a really human story. And so my job was in those 4 months to try and be, or get the physicality so embedded in me that when Felicity and I were playing together, we didn't have to think about it. We could just play the love story. James Marsh, our director, was very free, allowed us great freedom and encouraged us. We had Anthony's script, which was great, but encouraged us also to play around it. And he was asking if there were any scenes that stick out or specific moments. And actually, one of my favourite moments in the film is actually with Charlie Cox, who plays Jonathan. And he is Charlie's an old friend of mine. In fact, when I got cast in this, before he was cast, he called me up and he said, Ed, the great thing about getting the privilege of playing Stephen Hawking is you have no option but to give it 1,000%. And he was absolutely right. And when he then got cast in this film, having someone you adore, like who's a great friend in that part, was really wonderful. There's a scene when they're in the church, when Stephen comes into the church with the beer bottles, and Charlie was feeding me the beer, and then it was my first day in that level of physicality, and the first days in those physicalities, you were always worried, am I taking it too far or not far enough, and so I was quite tense, and he was feeding me, and then he improvised some line which was like, be careful, you got to drive, or something like this, and I completely lost it. Like, I lost it, and then I was like, I've got to stay in physicality. So the take they use is that improvised line. So you sort of see me, but it sort of works, and it has a likeness to it, so that was probably one of my favourite ones. So James, our director, comes from a documentary background, and I feel like this term collaboration is thrown around quite a lot, but he has this amazing capacity to embolden every department, and everything about this film, everything affected everything else. So any physical work I was doing, if it wasn't costumed correctly, it wouldn't expose the thinness or the specifics of the physicality. If the makeup, that would have ramifications on the makeup, and the cinematography, what angle I was being shot from, all of those things really had to work together. And James did this amazing thing by like galvanizing each department to speak up. And similarly to Felicity and I, he really gave us free rein to play. And in the end, there were moments, originally in the script, I think it had cards that went 5 years later, 10 years later. And James wanted to make time fluid in it. So he brought all those passages where, at the end of the day, you would try and snatch 5 minutes for Felicity and I and the kids to improvise together, and he would catch that sort of home footage in order that it just sort of shows time progressing rather than being too linear with it.
Since this was not shot in sequence, how do you keep track of where you are in the illness, in what's happening to him physically all through his life, or what's portrayed here, even though you're shooting out of sequence?
Well, the amazing thing I had on this film, which I think as actors we rarely get, particularly on film, is time. We had, from when I was cast to when we started filming, there was about 4 months. And the day after I got cast, I went to an ALS clinic in London and basically just started educating myself on the reality of the disease. And I met with specialists there, and were introduced to people living with ALS and their families. And they were incredibly generous and invited me into their homes, some of them. But what was complicated was, with ALS, you have what are called upper neurons and lower neurons, and if your upper neurons stop working, there's a kind of spasticity, a kind of rigidity that happens, and if your lower neurons stop working, there's a kind of softness, a wilting, and ALS is a combination of those two things, but how it manifests itself, so what is upper and what is lower, what is stiff and what is and what is soft, is different in every patient. So it was about trying to work out what Stephen's decline was, and there's lots of documentary of Stephen, but that's all from the 80s when he was in the chair, when he became famous. And there's very little, or there's no documentary that I could find of him before that. So basically I took all the photos that I could and showed them to Dr. Seidel, who was the specialist I was working with, and she would decipher by, there was one example in which on their wedding day, Stephen's holding Jane's hand, and at a quick glance it looks like a totally normal sort of photo, except you don't see his hands on top of hers, and all of his weight is poured into hers, and his hand is soft. So Dr. Seidel would go, okay, so from that date, he's got lower neuron in his right hand. And we literally went through and deciphered what his decline would have been. And one really interesting thing, which you guys can see on YouTube, is Stephen did zero gravity a couple of years ago. He went up and did the zero gravity thing. And it's the only time you can see him out of the wheelchair, and he's floating and there you see which parts of his body have got lower neuron and which have got upper neuron. So it was a bit of an investigation, and I then worked with a dancer who helped sort of find that physicality in my body.
Were you able to leave this character, and or were there lingering things?
It was interesting. I've normally been quite good at if there's another job at kind of shedding a character, and it was a pretty rigorous shoot, and I haven't worked since, and it did take a while, if I'm being honest. I thought I was fine. People around me were like, no, stop. And I often find it weirdly in my hands, just in sort of in in that tends to be really quite often where I'll start with a character is in their hand gesture. So it did take a while, but I would have long baths. I worked with a very brilliant osteopath for the 4 months beforehand, who helped sort of align my body while we were filming it. There was an absolutely hilarious moment when, so I've been seeing him for a week or two while I was rehearsing, and he was like, Ed, you know, this is kind of intriguing. Your spine is beginning to do really sort of offbeat things. I was like, okay. He said, I think I want to write an essay, but I want you to be a test case. I was like, this is not what you want to hear from your Oscar. All you want to hear is everything is totally fine, you're absolutely normal. So that was discouraging. But no, it was actually okay, but it has taken a wee while.
HDSLR Shooter. Brought to you by Adobe, Akitio, Adamus, Black Magic Design, Carl Zeiss, Shutterstock, and That Studio.